So basically this talk is about critical thinking, specifically critical thinking of teachers in EAP. I often hear teachers saying that students have a problem with critical thinking. They'll say, oh, these students, they can't really think critically. I hear this quite a lot. And Julie King, who came to our department a week ago, she said the same thing. She'd heard members of staff saying that students weren't very good critical thinkers and we need to teach them how to think critically. But I wonder if teachers are sometimes lacking in critical thinking, especially about the practices that they do in the classroom. So I'm going to examine a lot of different things. Some of the things you might do in your classroom, some of the things you might not, but I hope I've got enough things that you'll at least do some of them. And you might not agree with me, but I hope that it will make you think about these things at least. So the first thing, are we always applying critical thinking to our practices? Secondly, where do our practices come from? Are our practices good for us or for the students? And this is something I'll examine later. And why I think we need more evidence. To soften you up a little bit, before I start talking about teaching beliefs, I'm going to talk about beliefs more generally. So these are some things that your students might believe. I don't know if you've heard them. You might not have heard them, but they are believed by, the top one is a Japanese belief. This is one I've heard from my Chinese students, and this is quite big in Korea apparently. And if you buy a fan in Korea, it has an automatic off switch, so that you don't get, the air isn't sucked out of the room and you don't die from suffocation. I'm not really sure how that would work, but that's what they believe, or at least a lot of people. I want to compare those beliefs with these beliefs. I'll just give you time to read them. So the reason I'm showing you these is because I believed all of these, and the last one kind of fell away a few months back when I found out that there's no such thing as left brain thinkers and right brain thinkers, but I have held all of these beliefs at one point. And maybe some of you, I'm hoping some of you until today believed some of these. And what I want you to do is to think about the reaction you had when you saw these and compare that with the reaction you had when you saw the Japanese and Chinese beliefs. When you saw those, you thought, well, they're a bit silly, aren't they? How can someone really think about that? When you see these, you think, well, I'm sure that's right. I'm going to go home and Google that. I'm pretty sure that's accurate. And you don't have the same kind of reaction. And I think one of the things I want to talk about is cognitive dissonance. And cognitive dissonance is this feeling you get when you hold two opposite or contradictory ideas in your head at once. So for example, you might think, I'm a fantastic teacher, my students love me, this class is going great, and then at the end of the course you might get some feedback to the contrary. I don't know if we have any Japanese speakers here, but here's some feedback I got from a course, and the student says, Russell is annoying, his lessons are boring. So that was that was a bit of a shock. Or another example, you might think that your husband is or your partner is a faithful, an honest kind of person, and a family guy, for example, and then you might get a bit of a shock. So this is the feeling of cognitive dissonance. It's quite an uncomfortable feeling, and the reason I'm talking about this is because when I talk about teaching beliefs later, I want you to think again about this feeling, and if you're fighting against some of the things I say, then that's good, but also, why are you trying to hold on to these beliefs? Go and check them out for yourself. So some things I'm going to talk about is confirmation bias. What do we check? What things do we actually check? Status quo bias, do we prefer our norms? Do we prefer to keep doing the things we've always done? Popularity, do we do what other people do? Authority, do we believe what we're told? And convenience, do we do what's easy for us? So going more specifically to teaching now, the Janus moment for medicine came probably about 100 years ago, and when medical practitioners started using evidence-based medicine. And I think Swan here sums up the kind of situation that teachers have at the moment. I'll just let you read that. I think teachers especially are a particularly tough bunch. I mean doctors as well. Doctors, when they were told they were wrong about things, they were quite resistant to this idea because they knew best. They'd done it, it worked. They did it and they're sure their patients benefited from it. And I think teachers can be the same. They're used to giving the answers and telling students that they're right, and someone tells them actually the evidence shows that you're not right, and they'll say, well, that's ridiculous, I know, I'm a teacher, you know, I've done this for years, so of course. And one of the first things I want to look at is learner training, especially training students in skills. And I think that it can be quite useful, learner training, and I think it works on the idea of give a man a fish. This kind of, I don't know if you've seen this advert, give a man a fish and he can feed his family for a day, teach him how to fish and he can feed his family forever, I guess. And so I think that's the idea behind skills. If you can teach something which is very beneficial to students, generally, rather than teaching them some specific language, it can have a benefit over a long time. But I think there's a problem with balance sometimes that I see. Whether the balance gets a bit out of whack sometimes, and we might be teaching students things which are, I mean, with the example of the fisherman, if you send him off to fishing school for 3 months and his family starved to death, then it's not particularly very useful. The first thing I want to look at is learner styles. And you might have seen this before, they're very well known. A piece of research that I don't have on this slide said that something like 93% of teachers buy into the idea of learning styles. They're very, very popular. There's many different types. This is from a study by Cofield. CELTA promotes them. If you do a CELTA certificate, you have to be able to demonstrate different learning styles and preferences. There is a problem with all of this though. As Pashler noted in 2008, the contrast between the enormous popularity of learning styles approach within education and the lack of credible evidence for its utility is, in our opinion, striking and disturbing. So they're very popular, they're very widely used, but there isn't any actual evidence that they kind of exist, which is quite a shocking thing. So there's no evidence that people learn through a dominant sense. There's no evidence that if they did, we could do anything with that information. There's no evidence that if we did differentiate, it would be effective. And there's no evidence that senses can be separated. And by this, I mean, if a person is kinesthetic, we often say, oh, well, if you're kinesthetic, you should take notes in lectures. That's good for kinesthetic people. Take some notes. If they're taking notes, they're looking at the paper. And they're also listening to the lecture. So I don't know how that's separated out. That seems a little bit confusing. There's some further criticism there that I'll let you have a look at. What I think is quite funny about Ellis is, if you get a chance to read Rod Ellis's, tome on second language acquisition, he doesn't even revise his original chapter. He just quotes himself. So nothing's changed in the 10 years since I wrote the last book, and yet they still are hugely popular. Okay, the next thing I'm going to look at is more specifically study skills. You might know this book, it's incredibly popular. We've got about 10 copies in Leicester, and we do teach from it sometimes. I think it probably has some good information in there. It was designed originally for mature students going back to study, and it's got some great things in there, but sometimes I worry about some of the sections, and this is going to lead to another point that I'm talking about, whether we perhaps have a little bit too much codified common sense. These are some quotes from the Study Skills Handbook. IT enables you to store large files of information. Okay, great. Abbreviations save time. If you have too much information, you need to leave some out. Well worth knowing. You need to research less, read less, note less, and write less for a 1,500 word essay than for a 3,000 word essay. Great. There is now a Chinese version of this book. Our students are often academics in their own country, and telling them things like this isn't particularly useful sometimes. So I do wonder who it's good for. So getting away from language and becoming a bit too concerned with perhaps other things. And one of the things I'd like to talk about now, which links to that, is reading skills. So I'm not, just from the outset, I'm not saying that these things are not real. I'm just questioning how they're used in EAP. So basically they come from the psycholinguistic model, and I'll let you read these quotes about the psycholinguistic model there, from Grabe and Paran. Just before this first quote, Grabe says something like, although it is very popular with applied linguists, it has been proven wrong. And I think, Paran said a similar thing in 1995 in the ELTJ, and said he's very worried because he thinks that things take a long time to change in the EFL world. And I think he's probably right. Skimming and scanning have problems. I'm not going to get too deeply into them because I want to, as I say, touch on many things. But skimming and scanning, guessing from context. So there have been numerous studies on guessing from context. And they've all shown that it's a pretty difficult thing to do. Actually, I don't know about you, if you speak a foreign language, what do you do when you come across an unknown word? I reach for the dictionary. Guessing doesn't really work for me, maybe sometimes. I think also teachers can get into the mindset that it's effective because they will see the answer in the answer book and then they'll go and teach it in class. So they know what the answer is already and kind of convince themselves that it's not that difficult to guess. Or sometimes we get quite easy examples when we teach. I've found in books, it will be something like, it was cold outside, so John put on his green, jacket. Okay, yes, great. When actually the kind of things they come across, especially in academic texts, will be a lot more challenging than that. And I've spoken to students and asked them if they use these kind of skills on courses, and they often say no, they sit there with a dictionary. They sit there with a dictionary and their text, and they read it very, very slowly. So again, this is Swan. Why should students need training in making intelligent guesses? Are they less intelligent people? Yeah, so this is just really reinforcing that point. And I often think it's quite ironic, perhaps, that sometimes I meet monolingual teachers who don't speak a foreign language, and they say we need to teach them reading skills to students. And I think, well, if you can teach it to them and you only speak one language, why can't they do it? Surely if you can do it and you only speak one language, they've obviously learnt to do these things in their language. Maybe they have problems transferring that to another language, but if they do, that's probably a linguistic problem, and not a skills problem. So as I was just saying, maybe it's easier to divide skills up. So you can do something like this. Monday we'll teach prediction, and Tuesday is skimming, and Wednesday scanning, and Thursday is guessing. Friday you can do review or something like that. And we actually do this at Leicester. We teach this way. I teach this way, ironically. But I'm not No, but it is, I mean, it can be a useful skill, I think, but it's just, I think Scott Thornbury on his blog said something about that it's become an end in itself, whereas it was a skill before. It's become a kind of end in itself, and you see in aims to teach students the skill of skimming, whereas they probably know how to do that already. The next thing I'm going to look at is, I'm just going to touch very briefly on this theme of whether things are good for students or good for us. And one of the things I want to talk about is linking words. This is a worksheet from our department, and it's got a kind of a big list of linking words or linkers, or they've got various names. I'm sure you've probably seen things like this before, and you give it to students and you might go through it with them. So are these equal in meaning, and are they equally common? So for example, a word that I really hate is the word moreover, which I think Chinese students tend to use like it's a kind of decoration on a cake, and they sprinkle it over their essays. And if we go back to the slide here, it's just addition here. Moreover. So it's like and. That's what students are often taught. But I don't think that's how moreover is used. And to test this out, I built a mini corpus of Chinese student writing and native speaker student writing, and I counted the incidence of the word moreover, and it was kind of 20 times more among the Chinese students. And Crew has written an excellent paper on this, which I'd recommend, called the Illogic of Logical Connectives. And non-equivalents are frequently offered as equivalents in textbooks. And are they equally common? Well, Hinkle has listed the most common linkers in English, and I don't think this would be a surprise to any of us. However, thus, therefore, so. You would imagine that these are quite common. But if you give students a huge list of words and say, okay, these are all linkers, what students tend to do is take the ones and they'll kind of attach themselves to certain ones. Another research piece I did on cause and effect language for corpuses showed that the word cause, effect, result were very common. Things like owing to barely appear at all. But students might decide owing to is quite a nice phrase, or try and use it for, oh, I don't want to use the same word twice, they sometimes say. And so they'll have owing to 3 or 4 times in an essay, which is quite odd. So I wonder who it's for, these lists of words. Are they for the students or are they for us? If I go into a classroom with a worksheet which has 20 items on, or 5 items, I might feel more prepared if I have 20 items. Say, oh, we've got a lot to get through today. But is it necessarily good for the students, or is it good for the teacher? There's also the question, especially in academic writing, of whether linking words are what create cohesion. When you read, or when we read academic papers, I often find that cohesion is created a different way. And I don't know if you've read in-sessional work, you often find students using them basically to start every sentence. There are many advantages to this. For example, da-da-da, however, da-da-da, in addition, da-da-da, and every sentence, and it repeats throughout the essay, this pattern. And that's really because that's what we're teaching them. And I've decided to call this smorgasbording. And you bring something to students and you say, look, here's a selection, you can just choose whichever one you like. And ooh, great, I'll have some of that and have some of this. And this is, I've stolen this from Jock and Susie's earlier, the example of in my opinion. If you listen to native speakers speaking, you'll often hear I think quite a lot, but in my opinion doesn't appear that much. To my mind, I mean, really? I believe, I've heard students say this and felt quite odd actually. I mean, there are times when you would say I believe, but students quite often say, I believe instead of I think, and they just see them as being interchangeable, and that's a big problem, I think. And that's because that's the way we present it to them in lists like this. Or at least we do. I'm not sure, maybe you don't. But okay, moving on. So I'm just going to talk quickly about the next ones because I don't know enough about them to really talk authoritatively about them. But writing feedback is another thing that perhaps we don't really think enough about. Most people, I don't know, but do you give students written feedback on their writing? And do you have a correction code of some kind? Is that effective? That's a good question to ask. I've been trying to find out. Trying to read the research literature, there's lots of it. There's lots of research about this, especially Truscott and Ferris, who've been having this kind of battle for the last 10 to 15 years. And in 2004, Ferris, now it might be a little bit more updated since then, I don't know. But in 2004, Ferris published a paper called The Grammar Correction Debate, Where Are We? Where Do We Go From Here? And she wrote this. So Truscott had basically said he thinks that grammar correction writing could even be harmful for students. We don't know. We just do it because it's done. Other people do it, students expect it, so we'll do it. In the last course that we did, we give students a mid-course test as well. We test them quite a lot in Leicester. And we give them a mid-course test. And I asked students about 2 weeks after the mid-course to write down on a piece of paper what they thought they had got as a grade and what they thought the marker had said about their writing. And from about 15 students, they all knew the grade. So they could all, this isn't very thorough research, but they all knew the grade, but only about 2 or 3 from the class of 15 could actually say what the marker had written on their script, which, I think that's quite telling in a way. Who are we doing this for? And the next thing, which is quite big, I think, is process writing. And I might be being a little bit cynical here, but Hyland said there's little hard evidence that process writing leads to significantly better writing in L2 contexts. We think that students need to do it. We think they need to learn how to draft essays and go through the writing process. But quite a few of them have already done writing in their first language. So why do we assume they can't do this? And Swan was talking about something a little bit different here, but I think it's relevant. I do not wish to be told I should be happy to substitute process for product. Product is exactly what I want. You're paying to learn a language, it would be good at the end of it if your language improved, I think. So where do these ideas come from? I think some of them are fashions, and I think some of them kind of spread the same way that perhaps you thought that you need to drink 8 cups of water. If it sounds good, you don't really examine it. If something sounds true, you think, okay, fair enough. You only really examine things if they seem at odds with what you believe or what you've seen. That's what most people do anyway. When I say you, I mean all of us. So some criticisms that I've heard from people about this. We've always done it like this. As I said earlier, this is called the status quo bias, the idea that what we're doing now is better than an alternative without actually looking at it. Number 2, I get quite a lot. I remember saying to a colleague, I had something published in Modern English Teacher about learning styles, and I said to one of my colleagues, not one of you two, don't worry, I said to one of my colleagues, I had this article published saying that I think learning styles are probably a bit of a waste of time, actually. And she said, oh, that's great. So what will we do instead? And I said, well, nothing. Nothing. Everyone does it. This is a kind of an appeal to popularity. Well, just because everybody does it doesn't mean it's right. It works. Now, this is my favourite one. And this really shows like confirmation bias in action. You'll do something, for example, I don't know, you might have some fans of dogme in the room, or the communicative approach, or task-based teaching, I don't know, whatever is currently fashionable. And you do it in class, and the students respond really well, and you say, someone says, well, I'm not sure about dogme, does it really work, it seems a bit questionable to me, and you go, but I did it with my students and it works. Well, you don't know if it works, really. You've just seen the students improve, but what would have happened if they'd had a different kind of teaching? You can't really say. But people convince themselves that these things work. Learning styles are useful. And the last one, but Harmer says it's useful, and this is an appeal to authority. And I know that teaching isn't a hard science. I am aware of that. I'm not deluding myself. But I think evidence can still be applied to it. Medicine is also not a hard science. It uses scientific methods to try and get better information about practices, and that's something we can do. So this is an appeal to authority, and if you look at the evidence hierarchy which is used, systematic review, randomized control trials, cohort studies, case studies, expert opinion is the bottom. It's the bottom of the pyramid of evidence. It's the least valuable because, again, it's just the opinion at the end of the day. It might be informed by experience, but experience can go awry. So why did you believe these things? That's an interesting question. And why didn't you ever question them? And really, I want you to think about that in relationship to your teaching. That's really what the whole talk is about. And I think there's a need for evidence, more evidence in teaching. I shall let you read those. Okay, and on a final note, just going back to the, because this originally was for, as I said, Nottingham, for the Janus moment, which is looking both ways and deciding to make a change. And I think there needs to be a change for more criticality in teaching, and you know, more willingness to criticise teaching practices and be willing to give things up which don't work. In a 2001 paper, Scott Thornberry said that ELT is at risk of being hijacked by men in white coats. I think the opposite is actually true. I think it's at risk of being hijacked by kind of pseudo-scientific strangeness that people just go along with. And I think we really need to, especially if we're teaching academic English, we need to make sure that the things that we do are grounded in evidence and academic. We can't ask our students to be critical thinkers if we're not willing to be critical thinkers ourselves. That's the end. Thank you.